if we wanted to, we could count on one hand how many conversations we've had in the last 12 months that have not included generative AI, but sort of what's the point? Instead, we often look at our watches when we're having a conversation to see how many minutes it is before somebody brings up Gen AI. So we went ahead and put it in the first words of the subject of this webinar, Gen AI. We're going to dive right into it. If you're familiar with technology business research, you know that we come at the technology space by looking at the individual vendors, by understanding what companies in the space are doing, their strategies, their financial performance, where they're going. We're actually going to flip it around today, and we're going to start instead with the buyers. We can look at what is been happening to buyers over the last year as Gen AI has permeated every single conversation. We're also going to talk about the ecosystem, so not looking at just the individual vendors themselves, but what's happening in the partnering ecosystem, how generative AI and how everybody jumping on the bandwagon, how all this hype around Gen AI has changed or how it hasn't changed, what's happening in the ecosystem between and when we say ecosystem, we're mostly talking about the IT services vendors and consultancies and their technology partners. And then the last thing we're going to do is highlight a few of the IT services vendors and talk about what we're seeing from them. And of course, we'll take questions. We're going to do this in a little less than 30 minutes, probably more like 15 to 20 to get through all the material we want to present, and then we'll jump right into Q&A. So with that, here's who you're listening to today. That's me on the left, Boz on the right. We're here in the office today. It's kind of fantastic. We have been having countless conversations in the last couple months in particular about generative AI. So what we're going to do is share a lot of what we're hearing, seeing, thinking, and where we think it's all headed. So Boz, you want to take us through the buyer's perspective first?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Want to highlight a couple of visuals from the recent survey we just wrapped up. We're actually still filtering through the data, but I asked some of my colleagues here on the data team to whip up a couple of graphs today for the presentation that we're having, and really something that it's confirming from the separate conversation that we are having with Patrick and the rest of the team when it comes to the enterprises. What are the enterprises thinking? How are they positioning their spend as they look into 2024? Everybody's been on the kind of like looking around and waiting for recession to come, for macroeconomic headwinds. And yes, it is happening. It's certainly something that we're not ignoring, nor the vendors or the buyers that we're talking to are ignoring. But at the same time, as you can see in the graph here, that's coming from a global survey data. We're interviewing over 200 director and above executives that are either influencing or having a final decision on the digital transformation budgets. As you can see, only about 26% of the surveyed respondents have said that they're putting their digital transformation programs on hold or they're not investing in the next year. So the other 75% are either continuing to invest, are no changes, or they're actually planning to increase their spend in digital transformation to ensure that business continuity. Probably not a surprise for some of you on the call, but it was a good confirmation to get the data back from buyers across the globe. And it's just illustrative of where the market is today. We know IT has become really that utility bill that everyone has to pay. And everyone is really thinking about, okay, where's next and how do I actually optimize my digital spend, which is putting some more pressure on the vendors to perform, on the vendors to deliver ROI. So while, as you can see, there's a somewhat positive sentiment in the market, there's still a lot of expectation from getting the best ROI from all the digital spend, especially as everyone is really looking at their cloud bills and they are realizing that they're not as low as they were initially promised, but actually rather higher than what they were originally promised. Obviously, GenAI is an opportunity for demonstrating that value, but it's such a quote unquote new technology that is still so much more fundamental work that needs to happen before can actually deliver the ROI from the GenAI. Maybe on the next slide, we'll see some of the drivers for the increased spending. So as you can see, we know it's more than one specific driver, more than one reason, but majority of the buyers are looking for making sure that they are staying in competition with their peers within the industry. Cybersecurity, which I think is probably not a surprise, given the complexity that's increasing with all these new technologies, and GenAI obviously is driving some more implications when it comes to security and cyber risk. are some of the key components of increasing the spend and driver behind increasing the spend. And then on the third spot, the advent of GenAI has compelled the leadership to invest in increasing digital transformation spend. So that's a pretty high number given how old or how new the technology is as a key factor to say, okay, this is actually something we need to consider. From conversations that we are having separately with enterprise buyers through in-depth interviews, we're finding that it's a combination of either buyers making a dedicated budget for GenAI and really kind of like making sure they invest in, and some of them are willing to spend a little bit of a premium if needed be, or they're actually looking to be bundled into an ongoing digital transformation initiative. So early innings of the technology, but certainly ranked in the top 3 as a driver for increased spend. There's a lot of hope and the expectation that the technology will deliver what everyone is promising on. So before I move on to the next section, Patrick, did you have anything to comment here on digital transformation and buyers?
No, I just think one thing I want to make sure everybody understands is what Boz said about IT being the utility bill that you have to pay. I think we've gone through years where we've been looking very closely at IT budgets and how enterprises are spending. And with digital transformation, we constantly were looking for that increase, that next spend on the next technology. I think where we've reached now is that the IT budgets are so fixed in, again, that utility cost spend that the changes are going to be smaller, but significant. What Boz said about how the spend is going to increase for almost all, or increase or stay the same for almost everyone.
Yep, absolutely. Fantastic. So this is kind of a quick preview, as we said, on the buyer side. We'll be publishing our digital transformation voice of the customer research right after Thanksgiving. So we'll have a little bit more detailed data across various areas of the research, including the barriers and adoption and kind of like the behavior looking forward. Obviously, GenAI is a topic of that research as well. But I just want to kind of highlight some data that we just captured from the initial results that we got in-house here. So we'll now move on to the next section, which is focusing on the ecosystems and really understanding, ecosystem discussion is not something that is not new. And we have been dabbling with our research and expanding our research and evolving our research with increasing focus on ecosystems for a few reasons. One of which is how buyers are looking to procure services through more of that multi-party discussion, multi-party go-to-market, how the way vendors come together to deliver those services and technologies, but also how actually vendors are able to demonstrate the separation of labor and the knowledge and the depth of the capabilities. So we've been kind of putting the prism of our research around multi-enterprise, multi-party partner network, and to ensure that we understand what's the intersection between technology and services providers, what are the expectations of each other, how are they seeing each other's strengths and weaknesses, and how are they investing enough of each other? Do they know, what the other party is offering and how important that offering is? Because just because they may be aware of a particular solution doesn't mean that it's the right solution for the client. So here on this slide right now, we have an example of the latest research that we published from our ecosystem intelligence reports. Focus on Adobe and Salesforce. And when I say Adobe and Salesforce and their relationship with 10 IT services and consultancies and digital marketing services agencies. And that's a continuation of a research that we had started, about 18 months ago, almost 2 years ago now, which focuses on cloud ecosystem market landscape, where we look at the 3 hyperscalers and their relationship with 10 services providers. Now we start expanding into the front office with Adobe and Salesforce and trying to better understand what are some of the nuances of the relationships in the front office. And Adobe and Salesforce are good kind of a pure play examples on the technology side, and then looking at the relationship with the 10 SIs and consultancies and agencies, because we have an ongoing research on the software side and the cloud side for sales and marketing, but we also have a research from our digital marketing services coverage, which allows us to provide that triangulation through different lenses and not just have a data in a vacuum, but actually having understanding like what does that mean to the rest of the ecosystem? How are those companies going to market together? How are they actually ensuring that their value propositions, incentive models, sales motions are aligned so they can best deliver, especially in a market such as sales and marketing that we'll focus on. That's the report we just started publishing. Publish it in September. The next kind of an extension of that portfolio will be focused on more like the back office and taking a similar approach where we'll be looking into relationship of services providers with the likes of SAP and Oracle and potentially Workday as well. So, and then we'll continue to add coverage from terms of the intersection of the reports and the vendors. But we're also going to start bringing up to market another piece of the research will be focused on what we call voice of the ecosystem, providing that sentiment analysis between each party, what they say about each other, what the expectations are. Similar to the way we do for voice of the customer, the customer view, we'll be adding that voice of the ecosystem in the partner discussion view. So this is just a preview of what we have done already, what's coming up, and just an example here of that Adobe and Salesforce report when we're talking about the data and the types of offerings that we are actually capturing in that report, which is in a similar fashion with the cloud ecosystem market landscape. So on the right side, you can see a kind of a tear sheet down of a particular profile for, sorry.
Which company is it?
We're looking at slide 7.
Yeah, let me pull it up.
Okay.
It is Salesforce, and I can't even. Oh, Accenture. It's Accenture. Of course, it's Accenture.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're not seeing something. Yeah. But basically, it's we're breaking down revenues, headcount growth, revenue and headcount growth for those 10 services providers, relationship with Adobe and Salesforce, and providing some analysis around what does that mean to the rest of the business. While again looking into that market, obviously the sales and marketing domain is a maturing domain. It's due for disruption, essentially, and we're looking into what are some of the drivers that are potentially impacting just the market. What does that mean? What are some of the nuances of the relationship that needs to happen? So where some of the areas that we're starting to see some traction is around multi-product sales motions, which essentially will necessitate some ongoing trust management between the parties. We've seen many of the SIs kind of like slowing down the investments in headcount, certified headcount, because we've seen them specifically for Adobe and Salesforce, but we expect them to start research, investing in developing talent, especially if those multi-product sales start to occur, especially coming from the SaaS providers. They'll push into and necessitate the SIs to have a larger bench so they can be the preferred partners of choice to deliver and execute on those services. We know that the SIs have been pushing and investing into hyperscale trained talent, but I think we're going to see some pushback and starting to invest in developing front office talent as well. And last but not least, there'll be a lot of need for planning for the emergence of the GenAI enabled industry applications that are obviously wrapped into those sales and marketing offerings. So just on kind of the high level nuances of that report that we found in terms of like what are some of the trends that we are looking into and how is changing the value proposition as we're thinking about how those vendors are building those practice areas for Adobe and Salesforce. But just want to kind of highlight the need for ecosystem discussion and an example of a report we just published and we started publishing this past September. Patrick, any comments on the ecosystem discussion?
No, I think we're going to come back to ecosystems in a few minutes, but I think if we pivot now to a couple of the companies we want to talk about, you're going to see on the slide that we've got 4 companies there, just sort of highlighting some of the announcements that have been made and some of the things that we've seen that these 4 companies have done in the generative AI space. And again, a lot of this is stuff that is announced. It's not the same thing as saying that they're going to invest and then seeing where those investments are, saying they're going to train, actually seeing what the results of the training have been. Those are all still yet to come. But we wanted to highlight a couple of these. And I'll go first to talk about HCL Tech. And the reason I think HCL Tech is interesting within the Gen AI space in particular is how adamant their leadership has been that generative AI is part of their ongoing strategy. It's an additional play for them, but it's not a massive pivot. They're not moving to become a Gen AI first company or something like that. Instead, they're falling back on their legacy DNA around engineering services, and they're falling back on their long established partnerships with Google and AWS and Microsoft to say, we're going to build out solutions around that are GenAI enabled solutions, but we're going to do it as part of how HCL Tech goes to market, how HCL Tech works with its clients, where it fits within the ecosystem. And I call that out in particular because I think we've seen from a lot of the other IT services vendors, particularly the India-centric vendors, a real push to hype the use cases that they have, to talk about the things that they're already doing with their clients, things they're already bringing to scale, which it's been less than a year now since GenAI, the ChatGPT sort of took over the market. And so in that 1 year, it's hard to imagine a whole lot has gone to scale. Instead, HCL Tech has been very discreet, very determined, very specific about what they're doing and staying within their own lane, which, again, amongst all this hype, I think it's really easy to get caught up in the talk about who's investing in what and who's training who. And instead, HCL Tech has stayed much more focused on what they actually can get done with their clients and what is realistic now. So I think that fits well within their overall strategy. They're sort of staying, again, playing to their own strengths, but that I think is important. Boz, you want to talk about Accenture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, Accenture is certainly a company that everyone's been looking up to when it comes to the investments, the depth of the investments. Not shy of investing and making big splashy announcements. Certainly, they have been doing that for a while now in different areas, like starting just 3 years ago with Accenture Cloud first and a $3 billion investment there. Quite a bit of attraction. So there's the good success record on the cloud side. So gives them a good opportunity to continue that, looking into the GenAI. One thing to highlight there with Accenture is really about thinking their acquisition strategy and the R&D strategy. I mean, they report that both they spent pretty much on a fiscal year basis, or at least directionally on the acquisition spend. So we often look into that acquisition spend to influence and impact the part of the R&D, ongoing R&D, because of how they're able to integrate many of those companies. Yes, they do get people as part of the organizations that they acquire and the skills and the capabilities, but they often also acquire IP, which then they can turn into and kind of fold into the bigger Accenture machine and build those capabilities. Another big investment that is part of their recently announced $3 billion data and AI investment was around the AI Navigator for Enterprise. I think that's going to be a key component when it comes to how they go to market and thinking about the platform-based approach the company has taken over the years to deliver services, drawing some parallels there with My Concerto for services in the application like Microsoft and SAP and Salesforce and others, just to kind of speeding time to market. Essentially, I think the AI Navigator for Enterprise will gives that kind of an edge again to that platform-based approach. And then last but not least, they just this morning announced that they are using the network of studios, I think starting here in the US at least, as a handful of studios at locations like New York and Washington, D.C. and Chicago and a couple other areas, like Toronto, I think I saw as well in Canada, where they basically were trying to bring back clients in person to demonstrate use cases for GenAI with specific industry, which was an interesting flavor there to see, which makes sense given the fact that often there's some key clients around those hubs to bring in, or take, for example, New York, financial services and life science, just naturally to have clients just because of the location, the way it is. Point being here is that those investments are important. Our job is to keep a track on the ROI and look into what's impacting. Accenture's have started reporting some numbers already on the GenAI front, and they try to stay very clean when it comes to the GenAI specific engagements. Obviously, many of those are just on the consulting front. They're not moving the needle at the global level, but they're certainly making people turn heads and ask for more questions, which that's what Accenture is for.
Yeah, that's actually, that could be Accenture's next tagline. So, all right, let's go to this last slide that we have today to present. And we sort of saved this big overview of all the big fat questions around generative AI until the very end, because we wanted to make sure that you understood where we're coming from, which was understanding what the companies are doing, understanding how the buyers are influencing their decisions, understanding what the ecosystem play is. So when we talk about some of the stuff that's on this slide, where we only have time to address a few of the things, you'll understand that we're coming at it from the perspective of having talked to, listened to, interviewed, and spent a lot of time with the different companies that are involved that we're going to talk about. So I'll hit on a couple things I think are super important on here. Boz will hit on a couple more. And then, of course, the chat function, the Q&A function is open if you have questions on this. And as you can see, there's a whole lot of, it's sort of like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. There's a lot on this particular slide. There's 1,000 different ways we could go down. One thing I want to highlight is under opportunities, this idea of curtailing the GenAI sprawl. If you think about where we were a year ago, that GenAI wasn't really on anyone's wasn't significantly on a lot of radars. What is so different now is that the generative AI demand is being driven both from the top and the bottom within organizations. And it's a reaching out and asking for those services and those technologies, as opposed to say where we were a year or 2 years ago with Metaverse, where a lot of companies that had invested money in Metaverse were trying to get enterprises to understand what the value was. Enterprises get instinctively what the value of generative AI is. The problem is it can very quickly become like bring your own device on steroids, where within an enterprise, the different versions of or the different applications of the different use cases around generative AI can sprawl in a way that can have all kinds of unintended consequences other than, of course, for the CISO, the nightmare around security. And with respect to data orchestration, it can be a nightmare as well. But I think one thing that we're increasingly hearing about is this idea that generative AI can create a bit of a siloification. That is a re-siloing of enterprises that have worked for years to try and break down silos between different parts of the organization. So I think there's a massive opportunity for consultancies here in particular to help companies curtail that generative AI sprawl by doing a lot of the things that are above that in the opportunities column there, including data orchestration, improving the value through use cases rather than just proving the value through, hey, it's a really cool technology that works really neat. The other one I want to highlight is in the gray section there on the bottom, where it talks about creating a roadmap that IT services vendors can implement and cloud infrastructure vendors can support. That gets back to what Boz was saying earlier about the ecosystem. And I think it's absolutely true that while everyone is talking about generative AI and while everybody has their own little flavor on it, it really still is like all of the other emerging technologies we've seen. It's absolutely an ecosystem play. There's no one vendor that's going to be able to come with every single solution or actually be able to provide all of the different components that are necessary within a truly fully enabled generative AI enabled solution. So I think we're going to see an increasing pressure on the IT services vendors and the consultancies to ensure that their technology partners know what makes them different. So we all know, that AWS, Microsoft, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and Oracle are the big hyperscalers providing cloud, but do those hyperscalers actually know what the difference is between the different generative AI offerings coming from a Deloitte, coming from a Capgemini, coming from an Infosys? I think the answer is probably in a lot of cases no. And if the opportunity around generative AI is as large as people think it's going to be, then playing within that ecosystem, ensuring that your partners know your story, ensuring that your partners are helping you sell what you're doing within generative AI, I think is going to be critically important. So we'll see how that plays out. That's another reason why we're spending so much of our time understanding what's happening in the ecosystems and the relationship between all these players. And I think generative AI only makes that more, as it makes transactions more transparent, as it makes those relationships more transparent, I think it's going to increase the importance of playing nicely in the sandbox, which is what it all comes back down to. Boz, what jumps out for you on this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the challenges are key here before any of this can happen. I think all challenges, ethics, security, data governance, we all know about those. We hear about all the time. I think it's important to highlight them because without the right data, how it's being managed, who owns the data, who governs the data, how the governance models, it's something that's a fundamental issues that need to happen first. And I think many vendors and buyers had a chance to test what it is to try to automate bad processes when the RPA came around, and they can draw some conclusions on their experiences and say, okay, well, it worked out here, it worked out not so much. I think with GenAI, given the sprawl of GenAI in terms of enterprise-wise and the need for enterprise-wise data management, there's a greater need for establishing the right data, the right governance, and kind of fixing the process first before actually starting automating everything that everyone wants to automate for the sake of automation. So I think it's important. Data security, I think, is it's key. just because, not just because of security, but it's you have to be addressed. Just to thinking about the data science and the security for data science, I think it's something that often buyers don't think about through the same lens. And when it comes to AI, so I think there'll be some greater need for discussions around as well. On the opportunity side, obviously, I think you mentioned, Patrick, data orchestration and increased cloud consumptions. I think one of the reasons GenAI became so popular so quick is just the push that came from the hyperscalers, because they saw the acceleration growth back in late 2022. So they had to find a new technology that was going to drive more consumption. So I think it's making everyone excited. We saw the recent results from Microsoft that were pretty optimistic on the consumption side on AI. AWS, not so much. Google still has some work to do, but there's some pockets of opportunities for those companies to start getting a little bit of a rebound in their growth momentum, just given the fact that what it takes from compute power. They also have to think about some of the next gen data centers, including the GPU ones, and we know that NVIDIA has some lag there up against. So something we are keeping a close eye and see how the CPU data centers are getting retuned and recalibrated to be more of a GPU like ready, essentially from a compute power consumption, so they can drive that increased cloud consumptions going forward. And last but not least, looking at the implication expectation, the emphasis on soft skills, I think it's an important thing to consider. We all been talking and thinking and writing about STEM-based skills, STEM-based education will continue, but I think we will see a much more push into liberal arts. Again, understanding, those degrees will play a role, because everyone, GenAI essentially has the opportunity to level set the field for skills. So the skills that will be required a little bit more, understanding the reading, the writing, the reviewing, and having the soft skills that are in place to connect the business technology and the people that are using that technology.
Excellent, boss. And so that sort of wraps it up. We're going to go to Q&A, and I think actually your last point there on the implications is actually one of the things that kind of came up in one of the questions. So I'll read this one. And again, we still have time. People want to throw some more questions in here. So the question is regarding demand for GenAI skills in the large enterprise, where is the most skills demand? IT roles or business roles? Well, as you go first, and then I'm going to disagree with you.
Regarding demand for GenAI skills, where are the most skills demand, IT or business? Naturally, IT, I would say, but I think that's going to change just by the nature of the way the technology is going for. Again, just to my point just a moment ago, it's going to be a level setting, and it's going to be everyone's trying to train their IT personnel on the vendor side, right? On the buyer side, buyers are turning to vendors because they know that it's an expensive investment to train. It's an expensive investment just to have the compute power and everything else. So there is a lot of trial and error. So I think vendors are still in a position to be able to, go to market and be and show that, hey, I think we have some numbers earlier, essentially saying 80,000 people, or HCO having, or TCS making a big announcement of training its entire workforce of 600,000 people on GenAI. What does that mean? We'll see, but I think it's it's important to not just to make a big splashy announcement around the types of which skills, which roles are you training on GenAI. It's more about making sure that you tie to outcomes and make sure you tie to specific business use cases and ROI.
Yeah, and I think the other point I would make here is that what we've seen over the last 10 years is the IT function within successful large enterprises has become more of a business function, where it is truly part of what, it can be a differentiator. It can be contribute to the bottom line. It can help a company not only run more efficiently, but more profitably. And I think that is where we're eventually headed with GenAI, where the expectation is going to be that everyone who's in the enterprise will at least have some familiarity and some capability to work with generative AI enabled technologies. It sounds goofy, but I'm old enough to remember that, when email was a relatively new tool, there were actually email training classes. it's hard to imagine that now with GenAI, but that's actually what's happening. When TCS says they're training their entire 600,000 person workforce, that's what they're talking about, is that kind of, here's how you open your email training. But eventually what's going to happen is the skills that are required around generative AI are not going to be IT skills. They're going to be what Boz was talking about earlier. It's going to be those soft skills, the ability to understand the question you're really asking and the ability to translate whatever answer comes back from the technology into something useful within the business and something that another person can understand. We keep coming back to it again and again in all the discussions we have around generative AI, that the robots are not actually going to replace the people. It's the people who know how to use the robots that are going to replace the people that don't. And with that, I think we're pretty much up on time. Is there another question that's come in?
Yep.
Okay. I can't see it for some
I can
reason.
read it. You can start the answer then.
Oh, well,
We can change roles.
that seems a little unfair, but okay. Let's see what happens.
The business side wants GenAI, but the security side doesn't want to expose their IP. What are your thoughts on getting better in the future?
So the business side is always going to win. If we've learned anything about cybersecurity over the last however many years that cybersecurity has existed, it's the business side will always win out. It will always push the envelope, and unless and I guess it's always until the security side comes in to clean up the mess. So there's a huge opportunity there and I'll say it's mostly for the consultancies to make the consultancies are going to make the most money on it in the short term, and the IT services vendors that provide the solution and the long-term managed services around cybersecurity are going to benefit in the long term. But it's also, this is why, if we go back to the one slide before this was, this is why this slide is so messy, because there are so many implications here. And I think one of them is this idea that I mentioned before, that if you allow generative AI to sprawl, that's exposing your IP. That's getting into the different silos within an organization. Who owns the data? Who is allowed access to the data? It's all these questions that are such a mess and become accelerated. The questions become accelerated, and the timeline around when you need to resolve them becomes tighter when you start applying large language models, when you start applying generative AI-enabled solutions into an enterprise without having thought through all of those challenges on the far left and then the implications on the far right. So again, the short answer to that, I think, is, again, the business side is always going to win, and it's up to the consultancies and the security folks within an organization to ensure that the risk is not the risk isn't catastrophic, I guess, or the outcome isn't catastrophic. Boz, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one way to convince each party to play along with each other is what we're starting to seeing and hearing from the buyers themselves, is how developing proof of concepts, right? And trying to stay with use slightly older data, right? From like maybe 3-4 years ago. Keep it on-prem, don't use any kind of a cloud-based, and it's trying to develop those pools of data that are needed for testing the models, for developing, even if they're smaller large language models, that way they can test the solution, they can see it's working, and they can see using the data that they know that if they have to scale the deployment, you have it will minimize the impact. Everyone is cognizant, everyone knows that there's potential for leaking data, for making sure that, but that's the job, for a cybersecurity specialist to stay vigilant, right? I mean, like Patrick was saying, business always wins. I think it's not going to be an easy transition to scale up, scale deployments. That's why we're seeing a little bit that hype has come down a little bit, because enterprises are starting to test, outline, and test where to invest. What are some of the use cases? More of a low-hanging fruit on the, more of a, tasks that are less impactful from both security as well as business standpoint, before they go into more of a complicated productivity specific use cases that are maybe they could create disruption on the business.